Hello, AP World History students with Fiveable. My name is Mr. Lassiter. It has been a very long time since I've been doing this, but we will get started. Hopefully, everybody is out there and can hear me just fine. If so, go ahead and rep where you're from in the chat, and we'll know that we're up and running. I'm not sure if you heard me introduce myself because Bottom was doing a weird little thing. I'm Mr. Lassiter. I am here in Durham, North Carolina, where I've been teaching remotely for a little over a month now. And we are here to do a little AP World History Review to you people who are as far away as Washington State, Florida, New York, Arkansas, California, McKinney from Tennessee. So all over the place. It's been a long time since I've done this. And part of that reason is because in the room right there that you can't see is a little baby that has taken a lot of my time. But I'm super excited to be back, especially in this historic AP exam this year for AP World History. So it'll be a little different. But today our aim is to give you some information regarding Asia in the 19th century to try to prepare you for what I think could be certainly probably like any other topic, one of the issues that might be addressed on the DBQ for this year's AP exam. We'll do a bit of comparison at the end. So some historical thinking skills there. We can talk or answer questions about how this might fit or what documents you might need to look out for. Or types of documents you might need to look out for. We can cover that at the end of today. But we're super excited to have you here. Excited to have Olivia and King Dan and all of you. So very excited to get started. I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller so you don't have to look at my my COVID beard, which is not looking great. And we will talk today about Asia in the 19th century. So when we're thinking about the 19th century, 1800 to 1900 is the 19th century. Sometimes we extend it a little bit longer in history. We might call it the long 19th century, everything from the French Revolution to World War I. A lot of times we do that in relationship to Europe. So some of the things I might talk about with Japan, for example, might go slightly beyond 1900. But hopefully, this will be helpful for you. A lot of stuff going on in this time period. So we're going to try to dabble in everything. We're going to hit the Ottoman Empire. We're going to talk a lot about China and Japan and India. Certainly, I will bring up Russia, though I'm not going to focus a great deal on Russia because a lot of times we lump that in with Europe in the 19th century. So I'll mention them a couple times, but we won't be spending most of our time on them. We'll spend some time at the end doing some comparison between China and Japan, as I said, and how they deal with imperialism and industrialization and all that's going on in this time period. This time period that covers the 19th century are units 5 and 6 in the new framework of the AP exam. Unit 5 primarily thinking about revolutions. And Unit 6, thinking about the consequences of industrialization, which brings in imperialism, which is really where we're going to be talking a lot about Asia in this time period. I know that this might be a tough time of year. Certainly, I know for at least my students, everybody's thrown for a loop with how school is going now. And the fact that the AP exam is changing and might just put a little bit more add a little bit more stress to you, but hopefully here at Fiveable we are helping with that a little bit. They're publishing guides every day. We have that DBQ guide out there for history, so make sure that you check out the Fiveable website for that. If you're taking any other exams, we have a stream for you. So Monday is math and English, Tuesday social sciences, perhaps you're pairing your AP World with a psychology course or something, and then Wednesday science, and Thursdays will be here with us every week for history. But we also have some other streams coming up in AP World History. So on the 21st, we have a stream, Globalizing Networks of Exchange from 1450 to 1750. And I think I didn't write people's names down here, but I think that's our very own Eric Beckman doing that stream. He might want to chime in to let you know which of these streams, if he's still in the chat. On the 23rd, in 1 week, we have the modern review for units 5 and 6, coming up with technology in the 20th century, and Q&A session, and then the 28th, expanding empires. So Eric is there. 21st is going to be him, globalizing networks of exchange, doing a cram session there. We're just really trying to make sure that you feel prepared for the units that can be tested on this exam, and we think you will be. For the latest updates, of course, follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I don't think we have a TikTok yet. But that's just a thing that I'm coming to learn. I actually went to the website the other day. It was enlightening, to say the least. Evan's got the tech presentation on the 27th. Excellent. Thank you for chiming in there, Evan. But what am I covering today? It took 5 or 6 minutes. You'll find out I'm long-winded like that. So just want to kind of give this overview of what we're doing here at Fiveable, and then we're going to talk first about nationalism. And I'll be honest, when I was putting this presentation together, I didn't really know the perfect time to talk about nationalism. It will come up again. We'll talk a little bit about it with resistance to imperialism in Asia, but we're going to address it first because if you go in order of how the course is written, you may have covered that first if that's what your teachers are doing. Then we'll talk a little about the Industrial Revolutions and its effect on Asia. Primarily, we're going to see that with imperialism. And so we'll talk about economic imperialism in Asia and what that looked like, and resistance to that imperialism. And then we're going to kind of tidy up the unit with a little talk of global migration. Now, let me just say that we have a lot of resources for you here on Fiveable that look very much in depth at a lot of these issues. I know in the past I've done presentations just on global migration in the 19th century. It was a topic I love. It was, so I know we have that. I know we have videos, tons of them on imperialism. So take a look at what you have. So this is, we got a lot of stuff for you, and we have a lot of materials that are archived here at Fiveable. So if you have questions about anything, by all means, ask them tonight. Interact with us tonight. Ask them in the chat, and they'll be answered probably for you. If you put it in the question box and do the formal ask question, I'll come back and I'll timestamp it for you. So you can come back to it later on. But your questions are certainly what we're going to be ending with today after we do a little bit of comparison, which I think is always good in this time period, just to wrap up what's going on in China and Japan during all of this. All right. So let's get started, and let's get started 8 minutes in. Let's talk about nationalism in Asia. Again, this course deals a lot with nationalism and the rise of nationalism in the late 1800s or late 1700s and early 1800s, especially in Europe. But these nationalist ideas that arise in Europe, and a lot of that is associated with the French Revolution and Napoleon spreading these ideas of people being united by maybe language or religion or some sort of ethnic definition to form a nation, and then those people sticking together. And a lot of times we use nation and country kind of interchangeably, but this is really when that idea of a nation of people united by things that might not just be land borders really comes to be. And that idea kind of spreads across Europe. And from Europe, it spreads into kind of the Ottoman Empire, where we'll start talking about. But then as Europeans engage in this new imperialism, those same nationalist ideas, that kind of ideology of nationalism that comes out of probably the late Enlightenment and early 1800s, that is going to spread to other nations as well. So when we talk about nationalism, keep in mind this is kind of a newer phenomenon that's often associated with revolutions in this time period, 1750 to 1900. But certainly it has major ramifications for how, especially empires, are formed and how they maintain their power. And of course, it's going to have a great deal of effects on the world in World War I and after, and then later decolonization. So that kind of background to why this nationalism that I told you doesn't really fit with the rest of what I'm going to talk about today, how it fits in here with our greater course. We're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire. So if you recall, the Ottoman Empire, that great large empire centered in Turkey, that controlled most of the Middle East and much and parts of North Africa, including Egypt, and even parts of Southeastern Europe. Now, when we get to the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire is starting to, have a bad time. They've been clearly passed up by Europe in a lot of ways as we get into the 1800s. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt really triggers the Ottoman Empire to realize that they need to modernize their military and they need to modernize overall. But as this idea of nationalism spreads into the Ottoman Empire, it is a force that can divide a multinational empire like the Ottomans. If you think about multinational empires, they have lots of different ethnic groups or nationalities within them. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was the same way prior to World War I, if you've learned about them. But the Ottoman Empire, you had a lot of different national groups. You had people, in Egypt with who had kind of their own history. People in Europe, you had Serbs and you had Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. You had Bulgarians and Romanians all within, and Arabs and Turks all within this Ottoman Empire. And even though nationalism can be a magnetic force that attracts and can kind of solidify a country under a single banner, it can also be a force, kind of the opposite pole of that magnet, that can force things apart. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, you had people in Arabia carrying flags that represented Arabian peoples. Greece is kind of one of the first places, at least in Southern Europe, that where that nationalism kind of bubbles up and leads to kind of a cultural awakening or reawakening of kind of Greek pride. And in the early 1800s, they fight a civil war against Ottoman forces, and this painting commemorates that. And they ultimately defeat the Ottomans by, I think, like the 1820s. Greece has attained their independence. In other Balkan countries as well, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, they followed a similar course. And what we end up seeing as a result of this nationalism kind of in the 1800s is the Ottoman Empire kind of losing some of its territory, losing influence over its empire, losing some territories completely. It becomes known as the sick man of Europe. That's kind of a phrase that's thrown on it because it is kind of this incredibly shrinking empire. That's what I call it in my class anyways. After it grows to its height, it just continues to shrink a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And ultimately, after World War I, it'll be dismantled, and Turkey is what remains of that. But even as there's kind of nationalism in the Balkan region that is a threat to the empire, there is a renewed sense of nationalism in the Ottoman Empire that kind of springs up in this time period. And it comes around a little bit later. In the 1870s and 1880s, after kind of this turmoil in the Ottoman Empire, and after we see people like Muhammad Ali in Egypt kind of take more opportunity for independence for themselves, we see the development of this Ottoman nationalism called Ottomanism. And it was a movement aimed at creating a more unified, a more modern Ottoman state. They wanted to try to minimize some of the differences in the empire. They did that by modernizing schools, trying to create more uniformity in local schools, to really kind of teach this kind of Ottoman pride, so to speak, kind of a nationalist pride. And some people didn't really trust this. So if we think about like how successful was this nationalism in the Ottoman Empire, maybe not so much as we might see it in some places in Europe with the creation of Germany or Italy in this time period. But nevertheless, they attempted that. to coalesce. And this was part of kind of a longer, protracted modernization in the Ottoman Empire that involved the Tanzimat Reforms as well, and eventually the creation of a constitution in the Ottoman Empire. But that's all to say, and I think I'm getting kind of more in the weeds here than I wanted to. So sorry about that. We definitely see nationalism as a force in this time period. That's what I'm getting to. And its effect on the Ottoman Empire, kind of this great Southwest Asian empire, is one that kind of starts to break it up, and then also tries at the same time trying to keep its core together. So that's the Ottoman Empire, nationalism. There are other nationalist activities that develop in other parts of the world in this time period, and we'll touch on some of these. And sorry, I missed that picture. That was a picture of the Ottomans signing the Constitution. By the end of the time period, though, we do see nationalist activity in lots of other places outside of Europe, outside of the Ottoman Empire, which you can kind of see as a Europe and an Asian empire. But national activity develops in China as a reaction to European incursion. India, the same way, as a reaction to British action there. It's going to result in this, what is called by some the Sepoy Mutiny, and others the Indian Rebellion of 1857. That fight in India will actually be, even though the Sepoy soldiers lose, it will be extremely important for the formation of India's kind of national identity. Instead of this kind of large territory with very different languages and cultures and traditions, we start to see kind of the foundation of a unified history in India. And of course, Britain building railroads and all that helps. But that Sepoy Rebellion will be kind of something people look back on as kind of the first attempt at uniting India and throwing off the British. Later on, the Indian National Congress will really further support and cultivate those ideas of nationalism, eventually resulting in the independence for India, and then, of course, the partition later in the 1900s. So, and Evan in the chat is bringing up there the Indian National Congress too, founded in 1885. So to represent the rights of the people in British India. I might have a picture of that first Indian National Congress in here. It might have been in another presentation that I was pulling my pictures from. There's also something we're going to talk about a little bit later as a reaction to imperialism. There are Filipino nationalist movements as well in this time period. And so the push against what was first the Spanish, and then later on the United States in the very late 1800s, really the early 1900s. A Filipino nationalist movement that we will get into in a little bit. We'll talk about that later on in this session. So those ideas of nationalism, even though in this course we tend to think about that and we talk about that in Europe quite a bit, they certainly spread and they spread to widely throughout Asia in this time period. So just kind of keep that in mind and those connections. All right, so let's take a hard shift here and talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and its effects on Asia. So I definitely want to cover this. I'm going to talk just briefly about the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to really hold myself to that. Keep asking your questions, by the way, in the chat or in the Ask a Question section, and we will continue to answer them for you. So you very likely know about the Industrial Revolution. So I'm probably not going to be telling you anything pretty that you don't know. This isn't a presentation on the Industrial Revolution. We have those too, by the way, here at Fiveable. But the Industrial Revolution, which really vaults Europe kind of far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of production, how much it can produce, and really is the thing that spurs on that massive imperial expansion that comes about in the 1800s. That leads to the scramble for Africa and British control of India and the Opium Wars in China. The Industrial Revolution, even though industrialization does not necessarily come to Asia like it came to Europe in the same way, the Industrial Revolution certainly has a major impact on Asia, because until Europe really starts to outproduce or to compete with what Asia was producing, Asia, they still relied on markets in Asia to go get certain materials. But as a result of the massive growth in these European economies and the massive growth in production in the Industrial Revolution, we actually see shifts in manufacturing taking place. For example, Middle Eastern and Asian countries, they were still producing manufactured goods in this time. But if we think about the share of the global share in manufacturing, that is going to plummet. It's going to decline. So instead of, if the output of Asian countries is basically staying the same and they're producing, however many tons of iron, or I'm going to make up a number, 1,000 ships a year, and that number doesn't get any higher. Well, if Europe had been producing 1,000 ships a year, then it's a 50-50 share. But when the Industrial Revolution comes to Europe, they start producing much higher numbers. And what we see are that those markets or that manufacturing in Asia simply is not going to be able to keep up and compete as well with those markets. A few examples of this include shipbuilding, especially in India and Southeast Asia. When Europeans come to the Indian Ocean, initially there is kind of a resurgence of shipbuilding industries and the economies in the region. But ultimately, when colonization takes place, when Britain comes in, for example, and decrees that only certain designated ships can sail in and out of ports, that's going to have a major impact on the shipbuilding industries in India, and then also we see that in Southeast Asia as well. For example, the Indian Navy ends up being disbanded I think in like the 1860s, something along those lines. And the British East India Company itself becomes the Navy for India. Keep in mind, this is like a private corporation, as if like Amazon would become the Navy for the United States if they built ships, which I don't know. Maybe you can buy boats on Amazon. Other things that we see are a decline in iron working, especially again in India. British colonial rule also affected the mineral production in India. During that era when the British East India Company controlled parts of India, there were high British tariffs that ended up leading to the decline of India's mining activities. And then Britain began to close mines completely, again, having a major effect on that country's ironworks. Textile production also suffers, especially in India and Egypt, again, British territories. And they were countries, remember, that were homes to textile production for long periods of time, especially when we think about cotton textile production. Here you see a picture of a woman with kind of muslin fabric on. But India and Egypt had competed for some time with Britain, but when we see that increase of industrial production of these goods, then Britain later on imposes certain taxes on goods that don't come from Britain, and it leads to a general decline. Again, Europe's kind of worldwide reach also ends up kind of harming Egyptian and Indian textile producers, as they just simply cannot compete with what the Europeans are doing in this time period. And so we have to say, well, so what here? So Europeans are making these goods, they're cheaper, but keep in mind that when you have some staples of your economy undermined by kind of this outside force, then you're going to have economic difficulties. You might become more vulnerable to the process of imperialism. And certainly Britain was able to take advantage of that in India. There are some places, though, that when they realize they're being outpaced by Europe, and I want to say that, pause for a moment and say that one thing to note is that there isn't something special about Europe in this time period that makes them way better at industrializing. There are certain factors that are advantages that Europe has that made the Industrial Revolution start there. And you have likely been over that in your reading or your classes. You may have attended a Fiveable session where we talked about the roots or the causes of the Industrial Revolution, and kind of the mix was just right for it to start in Britain. They were just the right economic circumstances, the right political system, the right geography, the right resources available immediately in that region, which allowed the Industrial Revolution to start there. So that meant that everybody was playing catch up. Everybody was playing catch up to Britain, whether you were in Europe or not. Everybody was playing catch up to Britain. So in some places, especially throughout Asia, we see that states or individual countries begin to try to find ways to help catch up, so to speak. And that is through state-sponsored industrialization. So governments began to take a larger role in, especially we look at the Ottoman Empire. I've included Egypt here, even though it's technically not in Asia, just because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. We see governments take roles in China, in Russia, and in Japan to try to industrialize, to challenge this Western domination of industrialization. The Ottoman Empire, we'll start there, even though they haven't adopted that technology of Europe, right? They're a little bit behind. In the 19th century, they're still trying to reform things, to reform their military, to catch up, try to build kind of a national identity like some of these European countries seem to have. And so they are going to sponsor a number of programs to try to modernize. So in order to strengthen their economy, especially as they're kind of being identified as the sick man of Europe. And one of the places this happens is in Egypt, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, although in North Africa. And under a man named Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, we're talking about the leader of Egypt. And so he was an Albanian Ottoman officer who rose to prominence in Egypt. He sorry, I lost my train of thought. So he decided to try to modernize and reform the Egyptian economy. And the way he did this were through a number of ways, taxes, etc. But he also pushed to industrialize in order to compete in textiles. So he had textile factories built to try to compete with the British and French. He also had factories to build up military armaments. So that, and he also set up facilities to build ships because he wanted to build his navy so that he could compete with the likes of Britain and France. And so in a way, he is really known as the great modernizer of Egypt. And so I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. And it was done all through state action. The Ottoman Empire as a whole does try to modernize. We see that with the Tanzimat Reforms. And there are attempts to try to bring the Ottoman Empire up to speed with the rest of Europe. So the Tanzimat Reforms, which you've probably heard about, a lot of people love talking about this. It's one that I always have to kind of continually like remind myself about. I always have to reread it every year. For some reason, it's just something that I can't make stick in my head. And it was certainly a modernization of the Ottoman Empire to try to increase production and the like. But it was also kind of meant to bring them up into the modern world culturally as well, right? So there were a lot of old religious institutions, and we see kind of a greater secularization of the Ottoman Empire during the Tanzimat Reforms. But things that they did were introduce paper money, a post office, new banking systems, new law codes that were much more secular. We talked about Ottoman nationalism earlier, that idea of Ottomanism that develops. They introduced things like national anthem and a flag for the Ottoman Empire. They build modern universities. They produce steamboats and telegraphs, and they start building railroads, and they abolish taxes on non-Muslims. And in this era, they're really kind of trying to modernize completely. And that's sort of what one had to do on this process of industrialization, really trying to bring themselves, we always talk today about trying to bring ourselves and students into the 21st century, et cetera, even though maybe you've never lived in any other century. But the Ottoman Empire were really just trying to bring themselves into the 19th century at the time. And a lot of those reforms, as part of that Tanzimat reform was this industrialization, that it was state-sponsored. It was really led by the government, not just by some kind of capitalist drive for money. In China, we see the same thing. I mean, they are woefully unprepared for the Opium Wars, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And so following their defeat in the Opium Wars, the Chinese government started a program called the Self-Strengthening Movement, which sought to improve China, produce new technologies using kind of Chinese know-how. First, they focused on military armament, machines, and shipbuildings, and then they were going to focus on industry, building steam-powered plants and mining operations and telegraphs and railroads, and then they would kind of, in the third phase, deal with business. However, the self-strengthening movement in China is not very successful. It doesn't really succeed in modernizing China, and part of that is because of a lot of problems with finances and corruption, and so their attempts are not quite as successful. In Russia, we see state-sponsored industrialization as well. I know I'm not going to talk too much about Russia. I don't want to get too off kilter, but Russia, I think I have an image here. Let me see if I can go to it. Oh, this was the Ottoman. That was Muhammad Ali. Sorry, missed that. This is the Ottoman Empire signing constitution. So here's the self-strengthening movement picture. Sorry, I'm way behind. Here's an image of the Trans-Siberian Railroad being built. That's what I was trying to get to. So among other things, the Russian government really invests in trying to build up industry. Serfdom comes to an end in the 19th century in Russia in order to provide the labor force that are needed in cities to industrialize. They sponsor a large railroad building campaign, including the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which went from one end of Russia to the other. I hear it's like a beautiful trip to take. Maybe one day I will do so. But anyways, again, state-sponsored industrialization, governments trying to get their countries to catch up and not letting it just kind of magically happening, but really trying to force it to happen. And nowhere is this done better than in Japan. And Japan's state-sponsored industrialization program, maybe you can put it in the chat. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to wait and see if somebody will put it in the chat, what we call this era of modernization in Japan. I will give you a hint. It begins when Matthew Perry of the United States rolls up in all his with his whole crew of ships and says, "Trade with us." And Japan says, "Sure, but you have to teach us how to do all this cool technology." And you're nailing it. King Dan got it first. Georgia, a state I'm from, McKinney, Shivam, Meiji Restoration, exactly. So we're talking about Meiji Japan, and that is, an excellent example of state-sponsored industrialization. It started with that challenge to their isolation, and they're confronted by foreigners. And so these kind of very powerful Meiji oligarchs see an opportunity to jump on it. Japan had always been in isolation. Here's a bonus question. Japan had always been in isolation, but they had always kept one ear out kind of to hear what was going on in Europe. And they got it from one specific country, and that knowledge, that we have a term for that knowledge. I want to see if anybody can come up with it. But they always were kind of had one idea on, so Dylan looks like he's got the place. Now let's see if we can get the term. So he says the Netherlands, okay? And McKinney gets the term there, Dutch learning, nailed it. So they kind of had this ear out, and so they're kind of ready to put their finances in and kind of jumpstart this Japanese economy. And this kind of oligarchical class does that by restoring the emperor, abolishing feudalism, and reorganizing the country. If you ever watch the History of Japan video on YouTube, which I highly recommend, but a censored version, they wanted to do all the things that made them like Europe. So they wanted a European constitution, so they made a European constitution. They wanted a European style military. They had a European style military. They wanted to industrialize, so they industrialized. And so that is something that really it happened successfully in Japan. They reorganize their military. They build railroads. They build factories. And the government subsidizes this industrialization, whether it's tea or silk or building armaments or building ships. The government finances these reforms and really does a good job in kind of replicating the successes of Europe. And so, and keep in mind, Japan is starting very late here in this game. Matthew Perry, the Commodore from the United States, comes to sails into Tokyo Bay in 1853, and by 1900, Japan is an imperial power. They're taking over, these islands outside of Japan in 1905. Is it 1905? I'm getting my dates wrong. Maybe one of our teachers in the chat can let me know. They defeat Russia in a war with their great naval battleships, which leads Britain to realize, hey, maybe we should build a lot of battleships. And then Germany's like, hey, we should build a lot of battleships. And then they realize they have to use them, and so they want to fight World War I. That's an oversimplification, y'all. So the Russo-Japanese War, I don't know, maybe somebody can find the dates for that for me. But we're talking about a less than half a century now, Japan becomes a major power. 1905. Okay, so I had it. Thank you, Eric. So just kind of a remarkable state-sponsored industrialization going on in Japan. I could talk about that forever. This is an image, and Eric has seen this image before, I know, in my presentation. Anytime I talk about the Meiji Restoration or Japan, there are a lot of really great images from this time period, but this is one I use in every class I teach on this, and it just really captures a lot of the changes that went on in Japan. This is a picture, not a photograph, mind you, but an image, a picture of a bridge in Tokyo, and kind of the bay there where everybody has kind of gathered on the bridge. I hope you can see my mouse. watching a torpedo explosion in the bay, right? Kind of a military exercise. Look at this marvel of modern military technology. But also look at what they're walking on. They're walking on this iron steel bridge that is spanning the bay. You have these European style horse-drawn carriages, and you can even see soldiers here and sailors who are also gathering on the bridge in not traditional Japanese garb. We're not seeing people in samurai garb here. They're in European style garb. The people driving the horse carriages are in European style suits and top hats and bowler hats. Yet at the same time, you can see Japanese men and women in traditional Japanese attire. In the background, you can see kind of larger ships that are being built with these torpedoes going off, but you can also see traditional Japanese style architecture. And of course, the writing, the Japanese writing on the image as well. So it's just a really, I think, rich picture to show just how quickly these things changed, right? You have this kind of mishmash of culture occurring, of this industrialization and westernization at the same time. We're not far off from the era of traditional Japan. Sorry, I get overly excited about some things. This is one of those images I just love. So we're going to kind of have another hard shift after looking at that image. In this unit, kind of this time period, 1750 to 1900, when we kind of thinking about the course as a whole, there's a lot about nationalism and revolution kind of at the start. And then there's a lot about the Industrial Revolution. And then there are the effects of industrialism. And when we think about the effects of industrialism, the one that really is going to impact Asia the most is imperialism. That need for Europeans to not just get raw materials to make into finished products, but also to have markets to sell these goods to. And so that was also really important. European countries like Britain didn't just want materials from India. They wanted to sell their goods to India. That's why they make such an effort to shut down Indian textile production, and iron production, because iron production could lead to them fighting back, but cotton production textile production would challenge them. And so now they can sell their goods as much as they want within India, because people still need those goods. And that's why they fight the Opium Wars, because they want to sell goods to China. There was a trade deficit there. There's a ton of course, reasons why imperialism takes place. Dan, you mentioned social Darwinism, of course, is one of the many reasons why we see industrialization occur. But certainly, this economic imperialism is going to have a major impact. And we'll start with India and thinking about economic imperialism there. And it's, of course, driven primarily by the British. For a long time, European countries had traded within India, France and Britain, especially in the region. And then after the 7 Years' War, Britain takes a greater hold in India. And over time, the British kind of expand their influence. And that is primarily through the British East India Company, which was a corporation that was granted a monopoly over trade in India. And this company, of course, made arrangements and deals with kind of these regional leaders of India to try to make incursions into the region. And the British East India Company, as I said earlier, even abolished the Indian Navy in favor of their own. The British East India Company became the Navy for India. It also was the military for the region. This company ran a military with these sepoy fighters, these Indian fighters or Indian soldiers who were under kind of the direction of the British East India Company. And so this is kind of how Britain really starts to come into India, is through an economic motive, really an economic drive that this company wants to trade more and more within India and sell its goods there. As we mentioned earlier, there was that shift in textile production in India. As Indian textile production decreased as in lost my train of thought. Decreased in comparison to European production. Although there is going to be some pushback, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that in a little bit. But in 1857, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the Indian Rebellion occurs, sometimes called the Sepoy Mutiny, which spread throughout northern India. The British come in and they crush the rebellion. But that's going to be the end of the rule of the British East India Company. One reason why that I forgot to mention why the British East India Company had originally kind of conducted business there is because it was really difficult to get, make decisions long ways away, right? You have Britain, way over here. I don't know if you can see my map, and you have India way over here. So that's a long distance to cover, and technology wasn't great when Britain starts this incursion into India. But by the time of 1857, when this occurs, Britain has a signal that, well, maybe the British East India Company is not doing that great of a job. And by that point, we have steamships and we have telegraphs, and we can get information back and forth much more quickly. And so the era of the British Raj will begin, or the British reign there, where the government will be directly under the crown of Britain and not in the hands of the British East India Company. But nevertheless, we still see that economic control of India, and then also a political control that goes along with that. Whew. All right. Another example of this economic imperialism of this time period is seen in the Dutch East Indies. So we think about this economic imperialism, where these foreign business interests have great economic power in a certain region. The Dutch East India Company, I know, very inventive. British East India Company, Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company had a monopoly on trade in the East Indies, which is present-day Indonesia. And that was basically where the spice trade was centered. The Spice Islands were located in that year, or in that area. They had been in control of that region initially. In around 1800, the Dutch government takes over. They kind of revoke the company's charter, and they take direct control over the East Indies, then controlling the spice trade there. They introduced something called the culture system in the 19th century. And basically what this did was these farmers who in Southeast Asia, they had to choose between growing either cash crops to export, or they had to give the government they had to work for the government in corvée labor, or what we consider to be like compulsory work. Basically, it's kind of labor as a tax. You have to work for the government a certain amount of time. So either they had to, take their fields and give, I don't remember what the percentage of their fields were, but dedicate a portion of their fields, which may have been growing rice or other, subsistence crops. And they had to dedicate that to crops for export, whether it be sugar or whether it be coffee or any other cash crops. And then they had to, of course, take that so that the Dutch government could export it. Or they had to work for the government for something along the line, I think it was like 2 months, something like that, that they had to work for the government if they didn't do it. And that culture system was in place for quite some time. If villagers couldn't, if their crops failed, then they were indebted to the government. They were responsible for that loss. And this goes on for something like 40, 50 years in Indonesia. So we think about you very likely know that Europeans had an imperial reach here, but these effects were very real on the people of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. They were affecting people's livelihoods. They were direct control of the region, and just completely upended life in these regions. The one that you probably know best, of course, is China. So hopefully I'll go a little bit faster so that you can ask questions as we get to the end of today. China was, the goal. That was, India was great, but man, China had a lot of people. And ever since basically the silver trade of the 15 and 1600s, Europe was operating at a trade deficit to China. China was making lots of stuff that Europeans wanted. They had great silk. They had tea above all that Europeans wanted to get their hands on to sell around the world. And Europeans were selling goods too, but China didn't much care about what Europeans were selling. They had kind of walled themselves off to Europe. They had limited trade to one port city where they could monitor and tax trade appropriately. But Britain had some ideas to overcome this Chinese isolation. Sorry, I had to give myself some water here. And they did this by using a certain drug, opium, that was being grown nearby in India and that region of South Asia. And so what they would do is they take this opium that they were growing nearby, and then they would just sail over to China and sell it. And about the time the Chinese government realizes that there is an opium epidemic on their hands, something that I think we can understand in this country as we kind of deal with our own opioid crisis in the United States. By the time China gets there, realizes what's going on, they try to put a stop to it. And they say, Britain, you can't sell this here. Like, we're not going to allow it. We're going to seize opium on any ships. You're not even allowing this. It was illegal in Britain. You're not even allowing this in your own country. Why would you sell it here? It's destroying families. It's destroying households, destroying the culture of China. And Britain kind of refuses. They keep doing this. China seizes a ship, and Britain demands that China not do that. And it ultimately balloons into what are called the Opium Wars. And the first Opium War, I think 1839, 1840, something like that. You can see how much I pay attention to dates. These Opium Wars, again, a result of that conflict between Europe wanting to get its economic hooks into China and China wanting to remain isolationist, wanting to keep its culture kind of walled off from the rest of Europe. But the Opium Wars really exposed how far behind China had fallen. Britain just routs China in the Opium Wars and forces China to sign what we call an unequal treaty. And that's a term you might want to know because there are some good examples of that in history. One of which is the Treaty of Nanking, which gave Britain most favored nation status, basically opened up China to trade, and then also forced China to pay back the opium that they had seized, allow Britain to continue to sell opium, and allow Britain to trade in many different ports. And then also if China made any deals with any other countries, which they do as kind of European countries start to develop spheres of influence in China and kind of or all kind of take control of their own ports. Britain also makes a deal that whatever other countries get, we get too. So that unequal treaty really kind of upends China. It's going to have drastic effects on China. And what happens to China in the latter half of the 19th century as it continues to weaken. We're going to see the Taiping Rebellion, later the Boxer Rebellion. China does make attempts at trying to modernize the self-strengthening movement we've already talked about, but it's just not going to be enough. And so China will the Qing dynasty, which is in charge during this time, it will kind of continue to decline until the early 1900s when the nationalists take over China. And they will be in charge until Japan comes in, and then communist China will arise. But that's another video for another time. And I'm not even sure that's going to be covered on the test anymore, right? Because that's the last unit. I've kind of talked about this resistance to imperialism in dealing with India, so I don't know what I can really say that we haven't already started talking about. But the Indian Rebellion, of course, coming out of mistreatment as seen by the Sepoy Army. There's also talk about the British greasing weapons cartridges with cow and pig grease, which, of course, for Muslims and Hindus would be against their religion. So that kind of is seen as kind of a spark for that rebellion. The consequences, as I said, were the British Raj coming in, but also that resistance to imperialism, that resistance to British imperialism is really going to spark that long-term nationalism that we kind of started this whole thing with. So that's kind of where it connects and why I wanted to talk about it early on in this presentation. So thank you for sticking around for that. There is, of course, other resistance to imperialism in this in Asia in this time period, and that is seen in places like Vietnam and the Philippines as well. So you think about resistance to imperialism and these incursions in Europe. Sorry, I'm on my notes on one screen. I was trying to get back to where they were because my connection messed up. Well, I'll just say, in Vietnam, we definitely see resistance to French rule in this time period, as the French were, we can't forget they had their own colonies as well in Southeast Asia. And in the Philippines, we see a movement called the Filipino Propaganda Movement. I think this one is kind of interesting because propaganda, we tend to have this negative connotation of, but there are kind of other things, kind of the idea of spreading of information that maybe not quite as negative. So when we say Filipino Propaganda Movement, it was really kind of spreading the ideas of Filipino nationalism is what we mean by that. So that's what really kind of I'm trying to, or what they were trying to get at with that term. So I just want to make sure that's clear. But the Philippines were under Spanish control had ever since the 16th century. But when we get to the 1900s, there were wealthy Filipinos who were sending their kids to school in Europe to study, and so they were coming back with these ideas of nationalism, similar to what we see in India. Gandhi, for example, great nationalist in India. He had gone to school in Britain and spent some time in South Africa, and came back to India to try to kind of further the cause for the Indian people. But people like Jose Rizal, who you see here, really lead a Filipino nationalist movement against Spain. And this marked the beginning of what we call the Philippine Revolution. And it was being fought against Spain, but then the Spanish-American War breaks out, and Spain loses that war. The United States takes control of the Philippines. And then we have what's called the Philippine-American War. And that ended in a U.S. victory, with devastating results for Filipinos. But it certainly was, that war was a result of that growth of Filipino nationalism. And then also that national, one thing about nationalism, it really doesn't die out until independence, until after independence. And so that continues on until the Philippines gain their independence after World War II. I was going to see if I had anything else really to say about Vietnam. I will say I'm not like an expert on Vietnamese history, but we do see Vietnamese resistance to French colonialism. I think it's sometime in it's in the late 1800s, like 1880s, 1890s. Hopefully, maybe one of our teachers here in the chat will know more about it. The Boy King in Vietnam. Yes. So, anyways, that's not one of the illustrative examples I typically pick in my class. So, I must admit that I don't know everything, folks. All right. Where are we at now? All right. So we've come a long way in thinking about resistance to imperialism. I've talked a great deal about, China and Japan, Japan's reaction to imperialism and how they modernized, China's reaction and how they were a little bit. Okay. Eric's giving me a correction. Listen to Eric in the chat there. Resistance maybe develops later. French colonialism doesn't develop until the 1880s. I'm going to defer to you. I have it written like half-heartedly in my notes, but it's something I did not go back for. So that's why you should always take good notes, kids. Speaking of notes, here's a chart that'll help us to organize some of the information I've talked about, especially in dealing with how these two great powers of Asia, China and Japan, deal with it. So remember, they kind of start out. One reason why I think it's good to compare, and sometimes that these two countries could be, it could be compared in a DBQ. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing a DBQ that asks about you to compare reactions to imperialism in some of these places in Asia. If that's the DBQ, then I would be amazed. I would love it though. So before imperialism, before Europeans really spread to that region, both these places self-imposed isolation. The trade was limited by the government. It really wanted to emphasize traditional values in China and Japan. And they have this initial imperial confrontation that really forces them to make a decision. In China, it's European powers at the door, Britain selling opium within China, really finding ways to kind of balance out that trade. In Japan, that's Commodore Matthew Perry arrived and demanding to trade with Japan, and of course, others following suit. And so then we have to say, well, how do they initially react to this? So if we're kind of comparing some of this information that we've seen, the reaction in China are that the Chinese oppose the British, and they do so. However, they are not industrialized enough or modernized enough to be successful in that. And so they lose the Opium Wars. Whereas the Japanese, they open themselves to trade and take what they can from European powers. Instead of letting European powers dictate what this is going to look like, they themselves take control of it with that state-sponsored industrialization. And the reforms come about in Japan with the Meiji Restoration, state-sponsored industrialization, railroads, textiles, all those things. In China, now they're kind of a little bit further behind. The government tries that self-strengthening movement. And as I mentioned earlier, that idea of being trained on technologies, but then the Chinese would master that technology and hopefully surpass the West. They were really just only interested in technology and not any of the social change that might come along with it that perhaps we see a little bit in Japan with that image I saw you earlier, focusing on military, armaments, and then industry, and then textile and cotton production in China. But again, it does not succeed. Just not enough financing of it in China, whereas Japan was basically all in on this plan. So what are the results of this? This era, if we're comparing kind of two of our major players here with China and Japan, you have China, where it has these spheres of European influence, a Taiping rebellion, which devastates China. And then later on, a Boxer Rebellion, which the government kind of tacitly approves of, which doesn't go well for them. And their government's permanently weakened. Japan, on the other hand, modernized industry, trade with the West. They defeat China in a war. They defeat Russia in a war, and they themselves become an imperial power. It's not far into the 1900s when they sign an equal treaty with Britain, basically considering themselves equal powers. Very different trajectories. What I would challenge you to do is to think about perhaps the third of the kind of big areas in Asia at this time. That might be India. What did it look like before the British East India Company came in? What was that confrontation? What happened when the British East India comes in? How did India respond to it? We don't see necessarily that many reforms, but we might say, what were the effects perhaps of the Sepoy Rebellion or the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and what happened under the British Raj? What did that look like for India? Of course, we do see the growth of Indian nationalism and kind of the unification of India as a result of that, but we also see Britain in charge until the 1840s. So just some things to think about. And, when you have large amounts of information like this, I think putting it together in a simple chart will be helpful. The last thing in this unit, and then we are going to just answer your questions for as long as we can, is just talking about global migration. Now, this is something that I don't know if it'll come up on kind of the limited scope of the DBQ on this year's test, but when we talk about an interconnected world in the 19th century, in the global world, migration is a big part of it, and Asia plays a large role in that. It plays a large role in voluntary migration, especially as Japanese seasonal migrants go to Hawaii to work. There is migration to Hawaii, some permanent, some seasonal, some even into the Pacific Northwest. Here you see an image of Japanese migrant farmers in Washington State. But Asia is also a place where coerced and semi-coerced labor is found. So, and I also mentioned, I forgot here, with voluntary migration, Chinese workers to the U.S., especially in building railroads in the 19th century. But there's also coerced and semi-coerced labor, especially we see after slavery is abolished completely in the 19th century, we see the reemergence of indentured servitude. And so we see a lot of, especially Indian indentured servants going into the Caribbean. On the top image there, you see Indian laborers in Trinidad in the Caribbean. Their Indian workers also go to East Africa and South Africa in British colonies there as well. So those, imperialist colonial connections also play a role in that. What are the effects of this migration and this outward migration of Asian immigrants into and around the Pacific and Indian Oceans? Well, we see one thing is, of course, a movement of culture. We see cultural enclaves develop, especially if you think about like Chinatown in San Francisco is kind of a famous example of that. But these enclaves that are developing in different areas of the world. Those enclaves formed communities where new immigrants could gain a foothold, but they also served as in some cases, targets for ethnic and racial prejudice, which comes along also, sadly, in the 19th century with this increase in global migration, which of course is spurred by a lot of things like industrialization and the like. And again, if you want more in-depth information on this, we definitely have videos on that on here. I think I've done one on global migration. But we do see, ethnic racial prejudices as a result of this. In the United States, it was the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which barred immigration from China. In Australia, it's the White Australia policy, which bans any migration to Australia from non-white countries. So that's just kind of a little cherry on the top of the end. I probably should have skipped over it because we are over on time, but I do want to answer questions. So if you got them, shoot. One question that we have in our question section with the days you shared at the beginning of the stream for future review dates, do we have times for those? And then Eric has been very gracious in putting the link in so that you can see the times for our presentations. And I'll just kind of repeat it here. I was trying to pull it up myself. On the, let's see, we got on the 21st, upcoming. Let's see. On the 21st, yeah, we have Globalizing Networks Exchange with Eric. That is a cram. I think that's at 7 p.m. On the 23rd, Modern Review, that's at 8 p.m. Technology in the 20th Century on the 27th, that's at 2 p.m. So take a look at that site and you will see those times. Thank you for your question, Olivia. Thank you, Eric, for putting the link in there. And I'm certainly here to answer any other questions that you might have. And even Eric or any of the teachers who might be here helping out in our chat, which is wonderful. If you have anything that I think I need to go back or maybe cover a little bit more in depth, I am willing to do so. We want to be able to make sure everybody feels satisfied here. All right, so nothing looks like it's coming through right now. So we will wrap up here. I do want to say, we have this new exam format, probably just for 1 year. It's the DBQ. It's 5 documents. And, they've kind of limited the scope in the time period that it could be, right? So we have to think, what could be something that they might ask, when you're studying. You want to cover everything, 1200 to 1900, basically. I think something in this imperialism era, maybe it's probably biased because I was just presenting on this. But if we think about something that might kind of connect to larger time periods, it could be anything with industrialization or nationalism that can kind of go farther back, that global connection, something that would loop in Asia and Europe together. Last year's DBQ was kind of along those lines, about trade between Europe and Asia. I know because I graded it and I had to deal with that inlaid box. So we have one question about accessing exams on accessing AP exams on the when AP exams when the date comes. I am not sure. I'll say that I'm not sure exactly where you will go, if they're going to have a separate site built, or whether or not you'll go through the AP. I know that more information seems to be coming out each week about the exams. I do know from watching the presentation that Trevor Packer did that there will be that you can basically take it anywhere that you can be on a device. So they're really trying to make it accessible to you, really encouraging you to, I would say, I think most people are going to try to be on computers and make sure that you can type your responses, which should help speed up the process of writing that DBQ and should help with time, certainly. It seems like it's going to be some sort of test portal that might have kind of a lockdown function. But I do know that Fiveable is staying on top of that. So keep checking your emails. I know that Amanda from Fiveable is sending out a lot of information with most up-to-date about keeping everybody up to date about that AP exam. I don't want to tell you exactly for sure what it's going to be because I'm not sure they've released all of the details yet, but just keep an ear out from emails from the College Board. Especially keep in touch with your schools. Your AP coordinators, your school should be letting you know. Or if that fails, contact us here at Fiveable. And there are some people who work Fiveable that have a much better answer than I do. Our June 5th dates for everyone who just got to be registered in it to be able to take the exam on June 5th. I believe that's the new exam date. Again, I can't speak for your school. So you would want to contact your school's AP testing coordinator about that. And the, if you're not hearing back from your school, keep in mind that people are busy. But I would say talk to perhaps your AP teacher specifically, and they can get in touch with that AP test coordinator. Otherwise, maybe your school district might have an AP test coordinator. I wish I could tell you a little bit more. I could tell you I know how it works at my school, but I don't know for everybody else's. Another question, definitely people kind of concerned about the, the nervousness of taking an AP exam from home. And what I will say is, if your internet fails, you can't access the exams. I believe they have set up a possibility for a makeup date in case you're in that situation where your internet fails or you have trouble accessing the exam. So there has been some talk about that that I've heard of. I don't know exactly the date of that. Right now, my first thing I would do is go look at my Fiveable emails because I know there's been some information shared about that. But I would say don't worry too much about that. What I would recommend is that prior to you taking the AP exams, that you make sure you set up a work area at home. This is something I recommend to my students right now as we're doing remote learning, and even when I give tests or assessments over remote learning, set up yourself a quiet space, a space where you're not going to deal with you're not going to have distractions, a place where you know that you reliably get your internet signal at your house. For example, where I am in kind of my office area upstairs is like directly above my internet wireless router. If I were in the corner over this, far corner of my house, I don't get great internet. On my computer I do, but like on my phone I don't. So it's not quite as reliable. So, making sure that you have that area set up, that, you let people in your home know that you are going to be taking this. They will, you can trust your family, take it seriously, give yourself a work area where you can work quietly and focus for that 45 minutes or what have you the test is going to be. That said, saying all that, this is a new and a different test format. It's not ideal for everyone, but keep in mind that everybody's in the same boat with this. This isn't something where some students are going to get a great testing experience in a classroom on paper, pencil, and then you're going to be stuck at your home. Everybody's going to be in the same boat. And in that sense, just know that you're not alone in this. And one reason why we're here at Fiveable is to try to build that community of learners, teachers, students, everybody who is doing this incredibly hard thing of taking AP exams. And you can do this. I mean, that's why you're here tonight, because you are putting in the effort, and that effort pays off. It really does. And I've always told my students that, as a teacher, I work my students hard, but it's going to pay off. We don't do these things for no reason. And so, keep in mind, I think you'll do great, especially if you're here, you're participating in these presentations. I really feel confident that if you're here and you're engaging in Fiveable, you're going to be great on this test, regardless if it was paper, pencil, or this curveball that's been thrown at us of the DBQ. That's it. I think we don't have any more questions related to content tonight. So keep an eye out for emails from Fiveable. Take a look that if a lot of your questions might be answered in the DBQ guide for the AP histories. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It is available to download from Fiveable. Check out the Fiveable Twitter feed that has a lot of information about it as well. Other than that, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to Juliana, King Dan, Olivia, Eric, Arosa, and everybody else, Dylan, Shivam, McKinney, all of you who are here tonight. Really appreciate your presence, and we hope that wish you the very best of luck. And we hope to see you in another session here at Fiveable real soon, perhaps next week, this week. Game of Fives coming up soon. So y'all have a wonderful evening. we'll talk to you later.